In 1818, 42 years after the shot heard around the world cracked across a Massachusetts field, John Adams was asked to reflect on the meaning and impact of the American Revolution. In this brief letter, Adams explained that the American Revolution was not a common event. Its effects and consequences have already been over a great part of the globe. And when and where are they to cease? But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. Revolutionary thought and thinking did not end with the Treaty of Paris, nor did it begin at Lexington and Concord. In this special podcast series, we'll explore the revolutionary ideas that were catalyzed and accelerated by the self-evident idea that all men are created equal, and what bold and new thinking that declaration is forged. Revolution at 250 is a special production of PreserveCast in partnership with Preservation Maryland and the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Our hosts are Katie Caljean, President and CEO of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and Nicholas Redding, host of PreserveCast and President and CEO of Preservation Maryland.
Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. Well, this is Nick Redding. You're back. You've joined us again for another edition of Revolution at 250, which is a special podcast series of PreserveCast that is co-hosted by my good friend, the president and CEO of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, Katie Caljean. Katie, how are you today?
Doing great. I'm excited for this one.
This is an important one because it involves all of our favorite topics: George Washington, whiskey, Western Maryland, all those good things. And we're going to be talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. And as listeners know, Revolution at 250 is sort of a special series of PreserveCast that's digging into revolutionary thought and thinking and how generations that followed the founding generation were inspired by those words and deeds of the 1770s and 1780s, and this idea that the revolution did not end in 1776 or 1783. In fact, it continued on and continues on to this day, as was suggested by people at the time. And so one of those moments that we want to take a look at is the Whiskey Rebellion and how to understand what happened in that moment and why it is part of the story of the revolution. And in order to do that, we actually have 2 guests with us today. We have Chris Logsdon, who is the president of the Allegany Museum, and Dave Williams of the Allegany County Historical Society. And we're going to be digging into this story both at the broad level and then even a little bit more of the granular level of how this all unfolded. But before we do that, I'm going to let Katie jump in here and say hello and then open this conversation.
Thanks so much, Chris, Dave. Thanks for your time today to talk about this very interesting moment in Maryland history out in Western Maryland. Let's maybe start off by, we'll go with Chris first and then Dave, telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and about your organization.
Sure. Thanks so much, Katie. So I am a Cumberland native, lifelong resident. Left for a little while, came back home, love it here, in large part because it's such a history-rich region. But I serve as, Nick said, president of the Allegany Museum. At the Allegany Museum, we really try to focus on the not just regional significance of Cumberland and Allegany County, but the broader significance of Western Maryland in greater Appalachia. We have an all-volunteer board, a great organization with dedicated community members who step up to docent, to greet, to share our story. Outside of the museum, I am involved on a broader scope. Of course, Katie, you'll know I'm a member of your board of trustees at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and I love bringing a Western Maryland perspective to the organization. It's truly a statewide organization, so having all those perspectives is great to us. More recently, I was appointed by Governor Moore to serve as a trustee of the Maryland Historic Trust. That carries with it a seat on the Canal Place Authority, which also is out here in Cumberland. Certainly would encourage anyone to check out the C&O Canal and the Canal Place area that we have here in the city.
Super. And we're so grateful to have those eyes and ears out in Western Maryland. So thank you for joining us today. And Dave, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and how it maybe complements the work that Chris is doing.
Well, happy to do that. And it's actually a parallel path. I was born here, left and came back, and that's really the root of my interest in my community. I was able to see the rest of the world and see how unique Western Maryland was. My professional background is as a marketer, and I've been a destination marketer running a shop in Allegany County for about 40 years. And I made the mistake of not stepping backwards when the Historical Society said, "Who wants to join our board?" And I've paid for the mistake ever since, in a good way. But we're extremely excited about our own focus because going back to 1937, we've been able to accumulate a lot of information and objects, curatable objects from the community. And we've tried to change the whole focus to one of people and purpose, that nothing just happens. And our focus, as we've articulated with the Allegany Museum, has been from the angle of programming. Who did what, and why did they do it, and when did they do it, and why does that matter to us today? So very much what we're doing is complementary to the great longtime work of the Allegany Museum. And Allegany County is an interesting place to be interested in history right now.
Well, maybe let's start there, a little bit of then and now. Maybe we'll start with Chris. Could you paint a picture of Cumberland and Allegany County? Oftentimes in these stories, place is one of our characters. So what is Western Maryland like in today's world? And let's take a step back into the 1790s, circa 1794 for the Whiskey Rebellion. And what was the economy like? What's the landscape like? Like what role does the environment play in the story?
Sure. Well, Cumberland, across the last 2.5 centuries is a classic American boom and bust town. A rich industrial era coming out of the late 19th century, well into the mid 20th century, and for quite a long time, the second largest city in the state of Maryland. We're popularly known as the Queen City, and that was an earned nickname. We were second only to Baltimore. But Cumberland's a bit unique because of its geographic placement, and this takes us way back, several decades even before the subject of our discussion today, to the mid-18th century, when Cumberland was, for a time, the westernmost point in the entirety of the British Empire. So Cumberland was positioned from a broader geographic perspective as a sort of natural hub, a confluence of passages from what was then the far west. It's crazy to think about the mountains of Western Maryland being the British American West, so to speak. But still, we were a hub by and through which resources from the West could be brought. And so from early days as Western settlement, Western military settlement at Fort Cumberland, which Dave can speak to in great detail and fashion, but then developing across several decades into that economic hub of sorts.
So what sort of economy was it, though, specifically? What type of work was happening during that period?
Sure. It was a lot of trades. It was a lot of resource, of timber, of Western product and the like. And Dave, I know you've made great study of Fort Cumberland, Wills Creek, as it was called then, right?
It's an amazing story. It's no accident that when Ken Burns did his recent special on the American Revolution, the first map he showed included Fort Cumberland. And that's the strategic geography that Chris is talking about. And what happened was that it was truly the first frontier out of the mid-Atlantic. So the community that most people understand as early Maryland was very, very different than what was 100 miles west at the very edge of the Allegheny front. It was truly a wilderness out here. And when Washington first came to Allegany County, no British wagon had been west of Wills Creek, literally. And so it was always been about this access to the Ohio Valley and the desirable lands west of the Mid-Atlantic. And that's the reason that Washington came here to begin with. And to a large degree, it's the reason why he came back during the Whiskey Rebellion, that this was the most convenient place to convene troops from Pennsylvania and Virginia to deal with this rebellion.
And maybe that's a good question, Nick, jumping back in here for the listener. Maybe that's a good question for Dave. I think if somebody is familiar with the Whiskey Rebellion, and you talk about it, it's primarily thought of as a Pennsylvania story and a Pennsylvania issue. But how did Cumberland and Western Maryland fit into this? I mean, we can talk about the bigger issue, but why is it a Maryland story as well?
Well, I think there's two reasons, Nick. That's a really good question. The first reason is that it is the way that Washington understood to get to the West, and it was a very convenient place near the Mason-Dixon line and a gathering spot that the band he put back together. He put the old band back together. He called Daniel Morgan. He called Light Horse Harry Lee, and their job was to organize Virginia troops. So the troops that Washington reviewed at Fort Cumberland in Maryland were from Virginia. And so I think our physical proximity to the farmlands of nearby Pennsylvania played a big deal about it. And it wasn't necessarily all of Pennsylvania. It was southwestern Pennsylvania, where there were a large number of farmers who used whiskey as a convenient way to get their product to market. It wasn't about distilling as a tradition. It wasn't about moonshine. It was about a practical way to use your crops for commerce. And it turned into an argument over taxation and ended up with significant numbers of people involved. There were over 7,000 people at one point on the rebellion side, and Washington's own group was probably close to 13,000 troops. So these were of similar size to the groups of troops that participated in the revolution.
That's really. I was just going to. Sorry, Katie. To just jump
Go ahead.
in.
I can say the same thing.
That's some real context there.
Yeah.
I don't think people recognize the scale of this. I mean, obviously, revolutionary armies aren't nearly as big as an army today, or even an army of the American Civil War era. So these are much smaller forces, but you're talking about similar scope and scale, which really gives you a sense for how scary and momentous this must have felt in that moment. To them, this was just as big as Trenton and other things like it prior.
Oh, and that's absolutely true. And in August of 1794, several months before Washington arrived back at Fort Cumberland to quell the rebellion, there were 7,000 rebels standing on Braddock's Field, which was the site of Braddock's defeat in 1755. And the city of Pittsburgh talked them out of attacking by giving them whiskey. And being very
how ironic.
and being very nice to them, But I think that part of this whole story, which is fascinating to Washington fans, is the process by which he acceded to Hamilton's demands. He understood the need for the country to enforce its taxation. But his strategy was not that different than he used several times during the Revolution, including at Valley Forge, where he would go town to town on his trip to Cumberland, and he would ask the locals to bring him the rebels. I want to talk to them. And each stop he made, he had a larger force over his shoulder because they followed him. And his point to each individual rebel along the way was, we are serious about this. Do not be deluded by the idea that we're not going to defend our Constitution. And he didn't really want to go to war with Americans, but he was very, very serious about showing force all the way to Cumberland. And that was somewhat similar to the kind of leadership he showed during the Revolution.
Do you think that some of that was reason? Obviously, like he's charismatic and able to reason, but oftentimes, you know, the question of why you're doing something. So maybe let's talk a little bit about why this tax was being imposed. Why was the government at this moment in time? What was the impetus for the tax?
Well, Chris knows a bunch about that.
All right, Chris,
I'm going to lead him into it. Yeah,
and you know, it was an important test of legitimacy, right? And in all of these historical episodes, these great moments in American history, you've always got to look below the surface, right? So what does the surface look like? The surface looks like we were less than 20 years out from the Revolution. We had just rid ourselves of, we can call it the failed Confederation, because certainly it didn't last very long. And one of the Confederation's great weaknesses was its inability to form a centralized revenue-raising system. And Alexander Hamilton saw that as a pivotal step for the new federal republic, that it would need to exert an extent of central authority that the Confederation never achieved. So at surface level, what are we looking at? We're looking at a collection of states and a central government that owed a lot of money because of the Revolution, over $75 million, which 250 years ago is an almost unfathomable amount. It's a huge amount. So, you know, how were they going to pay for that? There were a lot of import duties in place. So talk about history repeating itself as we have our conversation over tariffs now. But even Hamilton recognized that had its limits, that eventually it could be quite damaging to a national economy, thus defeating his purpose, his real goal. So this notion of a spirit tax was, I'll say, very unique for the time, right? This approach of taxing a domestic product, you know, after all these years of import taxation only. And it's important to remember that we call it the Whiskey Rebellion, we call it the whiskey tax. It was really a tax on all spirits. And you know, at the time, certain communities thought this was great. It was a sin tax. It was going to guide the republic toward a more, virtuous state. But it was deeply unpopular. And it's fascinating to look at how this spirit tax aligned in the reaction that it evoked with the earlier stamp tax or the earlier tea tax. So it creates interesting echoes.
Now, Dave, you mentioned previously that he was putting the band back together, right? Which I love that phrase there. A little tip to the Blues Brothers, I guess. But, you know, and so Washington is doing that. But on the other side, there's another band being put back together, and there are some revolutionary veterans involved in all of this as well. You know, part of the whole point of this podcast series is to talk about these revolutionary ideas and how they continued to inspire. And obviously, it's even more direct when the revolutionary ideas are inherent in people who fought the revolution. But the revolution ends. They go back to their farms and homes in Western Maryland and Western Pennsylvania. And then what Chris just lays out transpires. We have to raise funds, and so we raise funds on spirits, and that is very unpopular. How did the revolutionary ideals influence these veterans' response to the tax? Do we know? Is that part of what offends them so deeply and what brings them back to the brink of combat?
Nick, it's a great question. And I think the answer is yes, that Washington's own approach, town by town, was to speak directly to those people who led the rebels. And many of them were those revolutionary soldiers you're talking about. And he spoke directly to them about the need to do what Hamilton wanted, and that you were going to not risk your independence to give some authority to the government. And Hamilton was an extremely heavy hand in all of this. He sent notes after notes after notes that are preserved at Mount Vernon asking, what's at Fort Cumberland? How many guns are left? How much gunpowder is still there? He was pushing this very, very strongly. And Washington's respect for the revolutionary idea and his respect for the nature of you're doing something that's going to last forever, I think motivated him to take action. I think he was uncomfortable with the action philosophically, but from a practical perspective, he needed to address the fact that these were Americans, and these were Americans who largely stood up for him and the country 20 years before. And they were. And so
to that coin though, right? Like, so I'm sure the people who were in opposition also were feeling that it was their right to free speech and protest, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's a matter of perspective. Like which ideal are we talking about here?
Oh, no, I think that's absolutely true. And what Washington was trying to do specifically, and we're blessed by his own journals in this, that he was talking specifically to organizers, rebel organizers, Whiskey Rebellion organizers, that don't be fooled by the idea that we're not going to act on this. Mm-hmm. You know, he was using physical force and the growing number of militia who were following him across Pennsylvania as proof that this was a time to stand down in those personal conversations. So a number of people were charged and arrested for activities during the Whiskey Rebellion. None of them, they were all eventually pardoned. None of them served. So that was extremely interesting proof that what Washington was telling them had some credibility.
What are some of those? I was just going to ask Dave. You mentioned people were. Are there some notable examples that you would pull out? And are there any from Maryland, from Pennsylvania, or what did they do to get themselves in trouble?
No, there were some real stuff. In July and August of 1794, the tax collectors in southwestern Pennsylvania were very much at risk from these rebels. And they eventually attacked the home of John Neville, who was a tax collector. They burned it to the ground. There was a serious firefight for 2 days, and the home was being protected by Matt Anthony Wayne as a U.S. representative. And eventually the leader of the Whiskey Rebellion, a guy named James McFarland, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, he was killed in that fight around John Neville's house. And so there's a significant milestone in all of this that happened then. Then they gathered in large numbers near Pittsburgh, and they did not attack and fight then. And then Washington arrived on the scene a month and a half later. So there was a serious concern on the part of the federal government that they had to either resist this rebellion or diffuse it. And when Washington finally went back to the presidency, he left a very, very large troop under the direction of Light Horse Harry Lee and Daniel Morgan in place in Pennsylvania to make sure that what they had talked about was going to happen. So it was a very deft move on the part of an aging George Washington.
Did it leave any fractures within communities? Like thinking like boots on the ground, like within families that might be more pro-government versus pro producer, right? Like they're thinking about like the social divisions or like political affiliations, like any evidence of that?
Well, there's not much to know about that on the Maryland side. There may well have been in these Pennsylvania communities, but we need to realize that in 1794, Allegany County was only 4 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And literally there had been the lots in Cumberland itself, the city of Cumberland itself, as it was surveyed by Thomas Bell of Samuel, was only accepted and incorporated by the state of Maryland in 1787. And that 4,000 lots had been surveyed in Allegany and future Garrett County by deacons that were designed to be given to Civil War soldiers. So there was a huge on-the-ground reorganization of how land was owned and how the community was going to operate at the very same time this happened. So I don't know if the Whiskey Rebellion itself was front and center in what was going on in nearby Maryland in Cumberland.
I will say, though, there was, and you're right, Dave, there was some real, I guess, conflict among the citizenry. They were grappling with this notion of, we are now being called, we are being pulled into a larger national identity. And that was a bit disorienting. It's not Cumberland history, still Maryland history, though, in Hagerstown. Whenever the Militia Act was utilized, the Federal Militia Act, and these troops called up, there were draft riots. And in Hagerstown, there were over 150 arrests in a riot, those refusing to stand, refusing to join a federal force, to quell a rebellion that presumably many saw some merit in. It was hard for the citizenry to overcome the echoes of the revolution, to the point where, as Dave has detailed expertly, we see so much repetition, right? So after the spirit tax upsets those here in rural communities, you see liberty poles being raised. You see committees of correspondence being formed. You see, even among the rebels, they form a sort of Congress. Albert Gallatin, future U.S. Secretary of the Treasury himself, participates. So it's incredible how, putting this within the scope of, golly, this is less than 20 years after the revolution. We're doing the same stuff, except this time we're doing it to ourselves. So fracture we did.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, this is like something that hindsight kind of obscures, the fog of hindsight, is that everything seems so, if you're reading just sort of the chronological history of the United States, of course we declare our independence, and then the Treaty of Paris, and then, we go through the Confederation period, and then we go to the Constitution, and of course then from the Constitution on. But in that moment, the Constitution was very fresh. The ink had just dried. And so to people on the Western frontier, it was not so absurd to think that, well, maybe this is not the version that survives. Maybe we have to keep iterating and coming up with a better idea, particularly when you go through this generation of people who think that we can come up with the best idea, that these Enlightenment ideals, that you just keep innovating until you find the right thing. I'm curious, Chris or Dave, whoever wants to take this one. We've heard a lot about how there's the whiskey rebels, right? If you want to term them that. And then, of course, you have the forces of the government under Washington and sort of the leaders that he brought back from his old commands. I'm curious what the Congress thought at this moment, though, because this is also in the shadow of this time period where, Washington runs for 2 different terms unopposed. And so we're not really in this party era yet, but the party lines are obviously beginning to form. Is there support? Is there concern in the Congress about this very overt show of federal force?
I think you're on the money, Nick, because this is really the beginning of Jefferson versus Hamilton. Mm-hmm. And it's really the origin of the two-party system. So you're seeing a turning point in Congress that's based on this issue of federal authority. And that obviously echoes forward to this very day. So the Whiskey Rebellion is not a minor bump in the road in American history. And Chris speaks well to that point.
Right. I agree with you, Dave. You're absolutely right. And, it shows the brilliance of Washington, right? Washington is this incredibly complex figure. He's always seen, right, stand above all, a man of principle, and how many layers can there be? But there are so many layers, right? So while he is simultaneously our Cincinnatus, our general who willfully stands down with the notion that there should be others to follow him, that he will not be a king, that he will not be a dictator, he also recognizes the singularity of him. And so we see with a policy debate like this one, like you said, Dave, right, the start of the fracture between Hamilton and Jefferson. What is Washington doing? There are many arguments, I think valid arguments. He errs on the side of Hamilton, but he stands as Washington. He's not as interested in these debates of policy as he is about showing the strength, demonstrating the strength of a federal government. So, I'm not going to provide commentary, I being Washington, on the value or the merit of the tax, in so much as I'm going to say that if the federal government validly imposes a tax, as it did here, you better follow it. You better honor it.
And Chris, you make a really good point about the maturation and the progress of Washington the person. That when he first arrives in Cumberland, he is young, he is ambitious, he's a little bit on the wan side, and he's a little bit on the needy side. And he acts very impetuously at Jumonville Glen, and he's actually vilified on the floor of Parliament. Who is this guy who started a war with France? And he ends up sending endless correspondence about around Fort Cumberland about how the Maryland militia guy has better horses. He has a better uniform. And he's very concerned about that. Well, then you see him grow over these years through the trials and tribulations of the Revolution, and he evolves as a person. So the Washington that you aptly describe, who arrives in Cumberland in 1794, is very different than the Washington who left Cumberland in 1755.
Sort of like bookends to a career.
Well, that's what we're trying to sell, Nick. That his military career and his ended and started in Cumberland.
Yeah, well, maybe you could actually make a set of bookends. That's how you sell it.
I like it.
A young and an old Washington on either side of it.
I like it. Write that down.
Yeah. And maybe this is for Chris, because it's been brought up a couple times, and I just wanted to flesh it out because I'm curious, and maybe a listener is too. You keep mentioning that Washington is listening to Hamilton, and I've heard it suggested, did Hamilton want him to go even further? I mean, in crushing this, I mean, is this a measured response from Washington? And what could have unfolded if the Hamiltonian desire had been fulfilled?
Well, it could have, theoretically. I don't want to be drastic. It could have devolved into bloodshed. Now, that would depend upon, though, the reaction of the rebels, because I'll tell you, once Washington mustered the troops, traveling across Pennsylvania, crossing the Mason-Dixon, and arriving at Fort Cumberland, where there were, of this force of almost 13,000, about 3,200 men assembled. The sheer display, the level of organization, right? What Washington was able to demonstrate. And there's a great passage that I have here, excellent book, aptly called The Whiskey Rebellion by Brady Kreitzer. But he talks about the arrival of Washington into Cumberland and his placement at a headquarters here. And he talks about the officers a description of, as I said, the organization, the Light Dragoons, every man of whom cheerfully left the encampment to pay the president a compliment. You know, to the rebels, this was, for lack of a better term, an oh crap moment. You had the president acting as commander in chief, as Dave can speak to, arguably the only time that's really been done on the ground, here in Cumberland with this impressive display of force. So might Hamilton have liked Washington to proceed all the way to Washington, PA? Sure, I think so. I think he would have liked to see the rebels wipe their face in shame. But would the rebels, by at that point, already be well at home in their bedrooms? I think it's quite likely. I don't know about you, Dave.
No, I agree 100%. Washington's own journal is extremely interesting. In the last couple of days, he comes into Cumberland. He's not physically comfortable. He's not riding his horse the whole way. He's in a carriage. And when he learns that this reception is awaiting him, he wants to do right by that honor. And he appreciates the showmanship of that presentation. And he rides in on a horse and reviews the troops. And that is not something he had planned to do on his way into Cumberland. So he made a lot of good decisions that kind of played to Hamilton's goal without conceding Hamilton's methods.
So what remains of the Whiskey Rebellion? Are there any artifacts, places for people to visit? Like how do we get at this history in a tangible way?
Well, I think for sure Washington's cabin, which is on Green Street, only a couple hundred feet from the remains of Fort Cumberland, was used by Washington in 1794. We have very good evidence that he was hosted by Colonel John Lynn, who owned Lot 64 next to the courthouse, next to the parade grounds, and that he received provisions there and probably met with Morgan and Lee there, and that parade ground, which is now the courthouse in Allegany County, was absolutely the site of this event. So we have a physical structure that, although it was moved at one time to Bedford Road near Pennsylvania, and although it once served as a chicken coop, we think it's accurate enough to represent the place that Washington used at that time. And we've since found some really interesting records in Loudermilk. If you're interested in the history of Cumberland, Loudermilk's book from 1878 is amazing. We hate it because there are no footnotes in it. There's no research, but time and time again, he's proven right. And he has an interview with a 90-year-old lady as he wrote that book, whose father told her about provisioning Washington on the lawn of Judge Perry's house, which would have been correct in 1878. And that is where Washington's cabin was placed. And we have multiple records that prove that. So we do have some physical evidence of his second visit, not so much his first.
So Washington slept there as well as a chicken.
He did. Well, yes, he made.
Yes. But we're not, probably not at the same time, but
we're not sure. Yeah,
we can't be clear about that. Well, obviously there's the physical remnants and there's objects and museums and things like that. But then there's also sort of I guess you might say the cultural remnants, the cultural reverberations of this. And I'm curious, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the nation, what does the Whiskey Rebellion mean to this day in both Cumberland and beyond about protest, about democracy, about dissent, about the extent of that and the question of federal power? I mean, obviously this is a question that comes up during the constitutional debates. It pops up at this moment in the Whiskey Rebellion, but then all throughout American history, it is sort of an unresolved question. Because the Constitution, though it addresses it, it's not definitive. So does the Whiskey Rebellion, does understanding it matter to this day? Do you feel like you have a story there in Cumberland that's one people should understand because it still is relevant?
Well, I think Chris and I would absolutely agree that it's a story that's undertold, that it's not told in the nuances that you just shared, that important things happened in those couple of days that reverberated through the history of America. And I came from earlier today, planning meeting for our Heritage Days Festival. And we talked about that this year has to be the America 250 takeover of Heritage Days, that we have to zero in on these kinds of questions that you're asking. And we have to present living historians who speak to that. And, we want to know if Jefferson had to pull an all-nighter to write the Declaration of Independence. We really need to know that. And we need school children in town to be engaged in that. We're in a lot of discussion with the American Revolution Museum in Philadelphia, because they have a lot of really good resources that we would love to be able to present this September in Cumberland. So we're thinking the same way you're thinking, but we have not done a complete job of making that connection yet.
And maybe for Chris, as a follow-up to that, why is it so misunderstood or underreported? It's not maybe it's not that it's not important. It's certainly very important, but does it say something about the nature of the republic that maybe we're not super proud of, right? That we don't really have a lot of room for debate when it comes to what the federal government ultimately then wants? Or is it that just so many other things happened after the fact, and the fact that there wasn't bloodshed kind of diminishes it? Why is it downplayed? Why do you think it's taken so long for it to take its place in sort of the pantheon of American memory and history?
There are a couple of reasons. I think you make a good point about the glorification of the era after Revolution. This notion of storytelling about that era, neglecting the unsavory and at times downright awful details. This is an episode that borderlines. This is an episode of a brand new government making strides that are, arguably marginalizing, I'll say economically vulnerable people, and a protest which is pretty flatly quelled with an overwhelming show of force. But I think the lessons of the Whiskey Rebellion are quite relevant. As Dave said, it's a story that needs to be told more, because you have to ask yourself at the end of the day, who won and who lost? Hamilton got his show of force, but only 8 years later, the spirit tax was repealed. So there's this notion of protest as an American tool, as a means for our society to demonstrate that we are a nation where our voices are not only heard at the ballot box, and that as a republic, we expect them to listen to our calls, to our criticisms in between elections, as well as every other November.
It's an interesting point too that you make there, that I think all too often is lost, is that and an important point to look at different moments in American history through that lens, that just because something doesn't happen the next day doesn't mean that the protest or that act of the protest, I guess I should just say, isn't successful, right? If you look at through the lens, that lens, then you can see the women's suffrage movement, all through that it took a long time for that to come to fruition, but ultimately it did, and it did because of that overwhelming, consistent force.
Right.
And it's interesting that you pointed out 8 years later, they get rid of the tax that was so onerous at the time. It's interesting.
It's not just a force, it's a question, right? It's just questioning the authority. Authority is not important. It's just saying, well, why this and why in this way? Is there another way? If the question was really about the national debt and the answer was, well, we're going to tax spirits, maybe there's another way that we can find that revenue. And so it's just pushing back.
Yeah, you're right. It's not force. In so many cases, there's no force involved. And maybe that's also a lesson of this, is that if you want to oppose something, don't assemble, an army like the rebels did in Western PA. But
don't swing and miss.
Together. Yeah,
that's what they're saying. Don't swing and miss. That's right.
Yeah, and don't put that together. I mean, and obviously some of the more successful efforts at protest in later periods are very clear about that in their unwillingness to use any violence or even threat of violence.
Well, I think from Western Maryland's perspective, and I appreciate what our two hosts do in terms of Maryland history, there's a significant difference between East-West dynamics and North-South dynamics. And it's driven by geography. And so the people who live in nearby Pennsylvania, and Chris knows who I'm talking about, they live in Barrelville, but they're in the same geographic valley as Mount Savage, Maryland. And so their association with each other is economic, it's social, and it's not particularly tuned to the jurisdiction between Pennsylvania and Maryland. It's a rural connection of a community that leaves us a little bit isolated from questions of national policy and even statewide identity.
Yeah, that East-West divide, a legacy of the Revolution in and of itself, right?
Absolutely.
Something that the 1763 line and all that leads up to the Revolution is something that lingers and even reverberates to this day.
And it lingers into Cumberland's continuing economy for 200 years later, that we are still that gateway to the West, that the C&O Canal, the National Road, the B&O Railroad all came through this spot to get to the Ohio Valley. And that actual confluence continues to be part of our economy today.
What about whiskey production today? Is that still a priority for the local economy?
Do you mean the taxed or the untaxed part?
Untaxed.
Yeah. There are definitely untaxed producers who still live in Western Maryland.
And as Dave knows, at the Allegany Museum, part of the Historical Society's brilliant Heritage Days Festival, we at the Allegany Museum have our annual Whiskey Rebellion, where we have usually over a dozen distillers come for a sampling, and Dave and I have been known to
sample. That's right. Well, it's to me, I think though that the biggest question of all for us, and I know I speak for Chris in this way, is that the past is prologue. That the success of our heritage organizations, our history organizations, is a really good calling card for Western Maryland in the future. And because our authenticity is part of our opportunity. And the more people know about the nuances of the Whiskey Rebellion or know about the importance of us as a gateway to the West, I think the more attractive Western Maryland's going to be to them for many activities. So this undertold story is something we want to correct.
Well, I think maybe that's a good place to leave the conversation. This is, just one of those classically American stories, a little bit undertold as we've heard, but glad that we were able to shed a light on it today. We've been talking, of course, with Chris Logsdon of the Allegany Museum and Dave Williams of the Allegany County Historical Society, and I've been joined in that with my co-host, Katie Caljean of the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I'm Nick Redding over at Preservation Maryland, and you're listening to Revolution at 250, a special podcast series exploring revolutionary ideas, movements, and the people that shaped this state and beyond and continue to shape it today, and how those ideas of the revolution reverberated and continue to reverberate 250 years later. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next time.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland.
a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.